The reason why I wanted to kick off this particular update's reviews with the Porsche 911 Turbo S is simply put because, as far as I'm concerned, and I think for some of you as well, this is pound for pound the single best car out of the 5 in terms of how good it is for its price and across the board, from stock to fully built and everything in between, on-road, off-road, whatever really, drifting, drag racing, top speed racing, handling, circuit, dirt, snow, and that's kind of appropriate really because it's one of the relatively few occasions where Gran Turismo makes something which is not Japanese extremely OP, and they really don't do that too often. It does tend to be Japanese cars, and on many occasions it's justified. You know, the Skyline, the GTR, the Evo, the Subaru, they are great cars, the Supra, etc. Porsche though is the exception, and it's an exception for good reason, because this is one of those companies which I've always respected, and I will freely admit that I'm bringing my own personal preference and baggage, if you will, into this review, because simply put, I was never a huge 911 fan until I started featuring them in Beards and Cars. Between the 993, 996, 997 and 991, they are wildly different in certain ways, but there is a definite through line with all 4 of those generations, and this one of course carrying the baton further, being that 911 Turbo. It's always been one of my favourite variations because the Turbo, it's kind of the all-rounder of the group, if you will. You've got something like a GT3 for that track day, hardcore focused, professional driving machine. You've got the Carrera, which is purely for the fun of driving. It's a more entry-level machine. It's got only as much power as it needs. You've got, of course, the GT2 to be that super extreme mix of straight-line monster and track day car. Of course, the GT1, which barely qualifies as a 911 at that point. And then you've got the Turbo. And the Turbo might be the single most famous, most iconic variation there is, because if you think about it, it predates many of those others like the GT1, 2 and 3, and yet in every single era where the Turbo shows up, it's undeniable. This is an undeniable car because it's everything a GTR can be, but then some. It's lighter, it's more compact, it's, you could argue, prettier, and it has more character. So one of the very few critiques that you can have for the GTR is, again, having reviewed them in real life, they don't necessarily have as much character as some other cars which are way slower, because it's kind of a drivable computer, and they're well known for that. The Porsche 911 manages to very carefully toe that line between analog and digital. It feels like it's doing a lot for you, but not everything. You can still lose it, but as you'll see here at Le Mans, even when I overcook it and end up on the sand because it's fully built and it goes off on a corner, it's still a really forgiving car. Some cars you make any mistake and you'll start fishtailing around all over the place, even on racing tyres. The 911 just isn't like that, even without the advantage of 4-wheel drive. So once you add that into the mix, it just gets even better. Now, as I alluded to in my overall thoughts for 1.54 a few days ago, I said of course that you could tune this up to over 1,000 horses, and that you certainly can. This thing has crazy amounts of power when fully built, doesn't even need an engine swap, and even standard 640 horses isn't exactly lacking. In a 1,600 kilo car, well, by today's standards that's not overly heavy. There are plenty of cars which are a lot more than that, as crazy as it is, but you can drop that to more like 1,200. Now you're talking. 1,000 horses, 1,200 kilos, that's basically like 9FF GT9 kind of territory now instead of a 911 Turbo. And again, this is a 300 grand car we're talking about, which is fantastic in terms of supercar affordability and supercar bang for buck, because you could spend that on something like a Ferrari or a Lambo, and yes, they are very nice cars. And in real life, I would probably say you'll have more of a grin on your face in those kind of cars. If you want to win a race and have a grin on your face, a Porsche 911 is the more consistent car, and that's the key here. This is so consistent, and it's consistently good. That's the important thing, obviously. It's a brilliant car in terms of its all-round ability. It's got some pretty nice visual mods as well. There's no wide body for it, as I mentioned before, but you've got an interesting little selection of kind of factory-style chin splitters and wing versions, the little ducktail, the wing delete, if you will, and you can have that active aero up or down, which incidentally reminds me very much of like a Forza mod, the kind of thing which you do with like a Hennessy Venom, having the wing up or down as an option. In terms of its performance, its all-round ability, well, there really is nothing too special to say about it beyond the obvious, and that is that it's a really good car. It just is. There's no radical hot take that I've got to come in with, and I think some people find the 911 perhaps a bit boring because of that, and of course I fully understand that, because that's the exact reason why I tend to avoid stuff like the GTR. It's such an overplayed car, so overused in every single game, and for some people people, I could see you feeling that way about the 911. The reason why I give the 911 a bit more leeway is A, because it is a lot more fun to drive in real life than a GTR, but also in a game, there are so many more variations, and this is one of the great things as well about the platform. The 911 is a far more versatile car than people really give it credit for. The GTR is just a GTR. It's very good at that, but that is what it is. There's no GTR convertible, there's no GTR wagon. The GTR is a GTR, and then there's just slightly quicker or slightly lighter versions of the same thing. The 911, despite being based on the same underlying platform for each generation, manages to simultaneously have one car which will be a rear-wheel drive, stripped out roll cage track day car with active aero that feels like a race car for the road, and yet that very same platform will have a Rothmans livery-esque off-road version called the Dakar, and then another with all-wheel drive that does so much work to make it a far more forgiving car than it should be, called the Turbo, or in this case a Turbo S, all based on that same underlying platform. Am I gushing about the 911? Absolutely, because even if you don't love it, it is undeniable. And to me, that's why this is by far the standout for this particular update. It's not quite as iconic in this form, of course, being as new as it is, as something like an Escort RS Cosworth, but it doesn't even matter. This one to me is the peak car this time around. And to be honest, this car being as good as it is what makes the Mission X seem that much less acceptable for how just not good that vehicle is in comparison, which is wild given that it's still got more power standard, quote unquote, than this does fully built. So yeah, in future I'm looking forward to seeing what other kinds of 911 variation we might get. I'm not sure where they could go next, maybe another racing version, because now we've got GT3s, we've got Turbo, we've got GT1 even, which is usually the one that a game would miss. I guess maybe something like a Dakar, perhaps something like a Sport Classic, I don't know, maybe a GT2, that's a fairly big one that we don't have already. The options are still there, and doubtless we will see more in the future. For me personally, I think I might say that I'd prefer some slightly older ones, maybe more like the 993 Turbo kind of era, some old school 911 stuff, but we'll have to wait and see ultimately. That's it for my thoughts though on the 911 Turbo S. I'd love to hear yours below, and of course, stick around tomorrow for the next review. And for now, thanks for watching.